Hello, this is Derek Taylor, and this is your first lecture for IHST 129 Early Modern Europe. And this lecture is give you a broad overview of the early modern period, what life is like at the beginning of the early modern period in Europe, and give you a little bit of background. Your textbook kind of goes into it briskly without explaining a whole lot. So I'm gonna give you a little broad overview of things here and just talk about what life is like in the early modern period a little bit in the beginning and go over the basic contours of this. So let's get started then, shall we? Get to the lecture here. All right. Early modern Europe. Circa 1500 to 1800. Those dates are flexible, by the way. I don't, as you'll see, we're going to crisscross a little bit over 1800, but definitely before 1500 when I talk about some events here. But those dates are a little bit arbitrary. Again, what's modern, what's not, when the Middle Ages end, those sorts of things. Those are conventions. They're not meaningless, but as you'll see, they don't necessarily, they're not hard and fast all the time. So what was life like in 1500 or so, around end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the early modern period? Talk about place in the early modern period. What have life been like if you've been alive or I've been alive back then? I kind of want to just try to visualize as much as I can for you. If you were alive in the Middle Ages, you were most likely a peasant of some sort. Legally, a peasant, by the way, doesn't mean you were poor or dirty. You could own property, just legally speaking, a peasant. But if I worked on a farm, you probably lived in a village somewhere. The vast majority of people, I think your textbook says 90%, live in rural areas at the beginning of the early modern period. You're coming out of what we call the Middle Ages. Like that term dates from the 17th century. But you live in I think I got this from somewhere online, but it gives you a decent idea. You live in a small village. You might be on near some noble lord who owned the land. You would work the land for him in return. He would give you the land to use. You had a small little village. You'd have in the center of things the village church. That would be the center of life in a lot of ways. That would be the center of the community. And for the most part, this is what your world would be, beyond the woods, maybe. And so this is what life would have been like, right? You'd go out work in the fields every day. There's no, of course, artificial lighting back then. Again, it's a pretty miserable sounding existence when you think about it from our perspective. But if we're trying to think it from the perspective of people who lived in that time, it's very different, right? Again, we could never exist in this era. We would totally unprepared for anything like this. But their lives are hard. They work from sun up to sundown. They don't have the modern convenience of medicine, stuff like this. But as you can kind of see from the layout of this village, they do have something in a way we don't. And that is something that's a really stable, defined community. And this is where you live most of your life. It doesn't sound too great, but you could actually, you wouldn't actually be totally immobile, but you live, most of your life in your village. I don't know if you'd have an occasion. You might go to towns for markets, fairs and stuff like that, nearby towns that were bigger. You could, as we'll see in a moment, you might go somewhere else. Travel was more normal than you'd think in the Middle Ages. We'll get to in a second. But your life is bounded in a way. It's stable. Your sense of place is very much rooted. And again, especially hard for modern Americans, again, because our national heritage is kind of like movement. The first Europeans who came to the United States in the 18th century, were the first things they noticed was, French visitors noted this, they asked the farmers in the United States, do you share the same attachment to the land that peasants in Europe do? And they said, no. If you're not moving and growing, you're dying. They don't think like this in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period. In fact, that dynamism we associate with the modern world is actually weirdly going to come out of the same set of societies in medieval Europe. But there is, for the most part, this is your life, unless of course you lived in a city, which would be very rare. And those are the places where there is dynamism at the end of the Middle Ages, the merchant classes, But for most people, you'd live like this. And to give you an idea of what your, the sort of concentric circles of your world, this is just a map of late medieval France. To give you an idea, this is most of the territory of what would be modern France, but take a look at all the different dukedoms and princedoms and all the things that make up France. Most likely, you'd be loyal to the king because he was the king of the whole thing. But government's kind of a personal thing for the most part in the Middle Ages still. Your country, the place where you might identify with after your village or your town, might be just the whatever county or whatever dukedom you live in. Like someone down here, the county of Armagnac, right down in the south there. These are all self-contained little entities. They all have their own rights, their duties, and this would be maybe the boundaries of your world. And again, I emphasize this is nothing like a modern state as of yet. All of these different little sections of France have lots of different privileges, customary privileges going back centuries, that mark them out as different from each other. They speak to people in, say, southern France down here, a very different dialect of French from what they speak, say, in Paris. It's very hard to communicate across places like that because of this. If you've ever been to England, for example, they still speak more dialects of English in England than they do in the United States. I mean, there are places in England you go, you could not understand them. They're that different even still today with modern media. Go to the far north, go to like Cornwall in the southwest, and you're like, excuse me? So there's lots of differences, regional differences. These aren't yet modern nation states in our sense. And so you're bounded by that. It's part of your way of thinking, your world, the place of your world. But as I said before, it doesn't mean you might not travel, because people did travel in the Middle Ages. They would go to places like shrines and places of pilgrimage all across Europe and even outside of Europe. You'd have to be pretty wealthy to do that, to go, for example, down to Jerusalem, which is the place of pilgrimage. But there were local shrines everywhere in Europe, places where they had saints' relics, places where there were supposedly, miraculous healing sites, stuff like this. You can just see, take England, I know that better than anything else. This isn't all of them I list on here. In fact, Canterbury is the major site, the Shrine of St. Thomas of Canterbury in England. And people will come from all over Europe to go there. But there's also a very popular site in late Middle Ages for pilgrimage in Europe called Walsingham in Norfolk. So, if you live near it, you go do it. You go on a pilgrimage. Everybody went on pilgrimages in the Middle Ages, from every class. So it's possible you can move out of that. And that would be a boundary of your world, boundary of the sort of sacred world in which you exist. And of course, if you read Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, these could also be occasions for fun and very serious piety. That could be, you could have a good time. There's lots of different things. The sacred and the profane mix in the Middle Ages. In a way, they're going to be separated to a certain degree as you get into the early modern period. But that's part of your world around about 1500. And then, of course, if you thought about this at all, you have the larger world of Christendom, which in your mind, again, mostly means the nations of Western Europe. I'll give you a map here. Of course, they didn't have maps in the Middle Ages. The Kingdom of France is, as you can see, one of the larger ones. Crown of Spain here, the union of kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Two biggest ones. Kingdom of England, these are the big ones we know. What you have in the middle here, get to this in a minute, is it's all these states here, right where I'm circling, basically, except for Venice. That's what's known as the Holy Roman Empire. I'll come back to that in a moment. It's made up of all these tiny little states, a couple of big ones, but it's also a major sort of power in that time period. And then you can see that all the various states of Italy, papal states in the middle, and the Kingdom of Naples down the bottom. From the south, you might know of the Ottoman Empire, because as I get to the moment, it's on the advance in the early modern period, stretching into Europe. It conquers Constantinople, the old Byzantine Empire in 1453, goes into the Balkans and up into Europe in the 15th century. To the east, you have the Kingdom of Poland, the Kingdom of Hungary on the eastern borders, Transylvania, Lithuania, and then way at the top you have the Duchy of Russia, Moscow, I should say. It'll become, again, if you can see how far away by the way Russia is, it'll become part of Western European power politics by the end of the early modern period. So it's going to be involved. So this is the boundaries of if you even thought about this in the Middle Ages for an average person. I don't know what an average person is, but you get this, someone who's normal, doesn't have lots of money. And if you thought about them at all, you maybe think about the Eastern, Greek Christians in the East. But this is, Europe or Christendom at that point. Beyond that, your vision of the world is might look something like this. This is what's called a mappa mundi, a map of the world from the I want to say this from the 13th century, but you can't see it. It's not divided out too well there. You can see the sea there. You've had basically 3 continents in your mind. You wouldn't know anything else. Europe, Africa, and then Asia. And in the middle of the world, you can see this is obviously the Red Sea up here. In the middle of the world, in your mind, of course, this center right here is Jerusalem. Because the Middle Ages, they have a religious view of the world. They don't know about the rest of the continents. So this is the center of the known universe to a person in the Middle Ages. Then finally, you have a view of the universe itself. And again, for people, beginning of the early modern period, most people, this is what the universe looks like. It's made up of a series of concentric spheres. You should recognize the Ptolemaic worldview. You know what that means. In this image, again, from the Middle Ages, with the listing of the planets going out from the Earth, which is at the center, and the geocentric view of the world. And above it, of course, the realm of heaven, of the Empyrean, with angels around it. And so this is in your mind. If you have any map of the universe in your mind, it looks like this. In the beginning, at the early modern period. That's place. What about time? How is time in the early modern period? What's your sense of time? Well, of course, they have an idea of the life cycle of the Middle Ages, from birth to death. You can kind of see this nice little picture here from medieval manuscript from birth to death. And so, and by the way, the life cycle of the Middle Ages, if you think, again, we're thinking back, perhaps the phrase of the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, that for most people life was nasty, brutish, and short, starting in the 17th century. We tend to think that way about the Middle Ages, beginning of the early modern period. It's not necessarily the case, at least not well. It's hard. It's definitely physically hard. We couldn't deal with it ourselves. It's not the case that it's necessarily short. In fact, between about 1200 and about 1700, if you live to be about 21 years old, you live to be about 60 or 70. The average life expectancy is low in the Middle Ages because child mortality is so high. But if you get out of childhood, you have a good chance of living a nice ripe old age, in fact. So that's, in some ways, their lifespan is not that much less than ours. In fact, the average lifespan hasn't changed that much since Victorian times, oddly enough, in most Western countries. And of course, your life is bounded by the seasons. You work from sun up, sun down. You work, you go see if you're, again, I won't go through all the various stages. I didn't grow up on a farm myself, but going through farm life, the planting season, the harvesting season. You'd work hard in the summer months. You'd work less hard in the winter when it was cold and there was nothing to do. So everything goes in cycles. Life is very cyclical for people in the Middle Ages. They have clocks. They have, by the end of the Middle Ages, mechanical clocks and water clocks in the early part of the Middle Ages. But for the most part, sundials, stuff like that is the way you tell time. That's the way it passes. Again, it's not like us with our mechanical precision, the way we view the world, although that comes out of the early modern period, as you're going to see in the course of this course. Of course, you also have, and what this image is, by the way, is you also have a notion of time bounded by the church. The calendar of festivals and saints' days and feast days and seasons of the church, Advent, Easter, Pentecost, and then several major other feast days, Lent, and the cycle of the church in the Middle Ages. that will also be a way that you structure time, and that people have a sense of, what day it is, what time it is. And besides the reigns of the reigning monarch would be another way. But this is also sacred time and secular time in the Middle Ages, which again, this will begin to be eclipsed by the end period we're talking about in this course. And as ever, you have a cosmic vision of time in the Middle Ages, coming from Christian belief. You have, again, Bible creation by God in 7 days, creation of the world, Adam and Eve, them being kicked out in the beginning. That's the beginning of time, which would have been for them about a few thousand years before that. Again, their basis of their knowledge. Then, of course, in the middle of history comes the incarnation. This image here is from the late Middle Ages. Basically, the life and birth of Christ. You have him coming; he's born here. That's the Annunciation. You have all other stuff. You have him going to Jerusalem. You have him being crucified. You have him the Ascension here, and then this is Pentecost. You see him resurrection there. All that stuff that happens in the middle of history and your big picture view of the world. And then, of course, you get to the end, where you get judged by Jesus, and either go down or up, basically, even though there's purgatory, which is a big deal in the Middle Ages. So you have all of these, sort of concentric spheres in terms of place and time, in which most people understood the world prior to the modern era. Which leads me to the point of this lecture, is to introduce you to this idea. What do we mean by early modern Europe? What is early modernity? Are they getting to the party early? And again, one of the reasons we use that phrase is, we have this sense that modernity, it's a word that needs some deconstructing, but that there's a modern world and the Europeans got there first before the rest of the world. It's kind of a claim that they get there before the rest of the world, the rest of the continents, Asia, Africa, they get to modern technology, modern forms of government, that sort of thing. And of course, the word modern can mean a couple of things. One, modern can just mean what's the most recent thing, right? Not necessarily any particular, set of beliefs, but what's more recent, right? What's newest. But we usually mean something more specific, that passage into an industrialization, all those later things. So what is, we're starting in this era. I gave you that little preview, just talking about how do we go from that, which is still essentially, pre-modern in our terminology, to modern. And we won't get exactly to the modern world in the course of this course of our investigation here. What does it mean to be early? Where are the anticipations? We'll see some of this. We'll go through some of this stuff over the course of things. But one thing to keep in mind is that history has a lot of continuity in it, besides changes. We look back, as historians, we study change. Things that change, this is where you get from your high school courses, you're going to get, that's why they have these big blocks of time. We give them names: the Middle Ages, events, Reformation, Renaissance, early modern, all that other stuff. But it's always made up of this long continuity mixed with this radical change. My dissertation advisor, when I was in graduate school, always told us in the classes I told us students that everything in history is either a lot older than you think it is, or a lot more recent. And this is the case in some ways with modernity. A lot of things we think are quintessentially modern have their roots, their embryonic form, they're not fully developed, in the Middle Ages, sometimes deep in the Middle Ages. The whole idea, I list a few of them here, the whole idea of equality before the law. You'd think that'd be a modern thing. It's not. This idea goes back to medieval discussions of rights and stuff like this in universities, and even in some political jurisdictions, the idea that citizens, people who were citizens, not everybody in the city was a citizen in the Middle Ages, would have equality before the law. That's embryonic form, comes out of the medieval world. Modern natural science, you may not believe me about that one, but yes, that has its roots, again, the very embryonic form. They have nothing like modern science in actuality in the Middle Ages, but it begins with the medieval world, with its scholastic investigations of language. It will sort of feed into the early modern natural sciences, and we'll touch on a little bit of this when we get to the discussion of Galileo later on one of my lectures. But there are whole books written about this stuff. You may not have heard of this, but yes, we know this actually. Its roots go back to the medieval Middle Ages. Of course, one of the quintessentially modern things is the university, but of course, it has roots in the Middle Ages in Europe. The first one is founded in 1088 in Bologna, in Italy, and it's founded to train, lawyers and priests, which is why when you go off and you leave JCCCC and get your degree, when you go to the commencement ceremony, to wear this black robe and this black cap, that's because that's what people wore in the Middle Ages when they were training clerks, people, either lawyers or priests. So it goes back to that. And then the whole idea of national states. Again, there's nothing like a modern nation state in the Middle Ages, but in embryonic form, most of the modern states that we know of in the West, again, you can trace them back to the emergence of big national monarchies in the Middle Ages. So there's continuity. And in fact, it'll be probably maybe in some ways more, it depends on how you look at it, what you want to emphasize, I guess. But again, really until you get to, maybe not the end of this course, but until you get to the 1700s, it very much still looks like a medieval world from a certain perspective, does Europe. Although there already changes in the 1500s, as you've seen. So what's changed by the end of all this, though? What's changed by the end of this passage to modernity? Well, I should start with things that are the same. By 1800, by the end of this course, most people still live on farms in Europe, although that's increasingly changing. And by 1800, industrialization is going to alter that within a generation or two. The sense of time for most people, still limited by daylight, still limited by the seasons. That'll change again within another couple of generations. The 19th century, by 1800, the Christian view of the world is still important for a majority of Europeans. That'll change, obviously, eventually. And even this is maybe a little more, maybe I'm overdoing this a little bit, because by 1800, you've had a couple of massive revolutions in America and France. But I would say for most people in Europe, still obedience to political authority is still something they consider natural. It's not natural that you should disobey your superiors. It takes a long time to get rid of that idea. And that's one of the quintessentially modern things that we take for granted. Change then. What are the biggest things that change? How do these things change? Well, there's several things. I'll pick out three here. And this will get into some of my lectures later on in the semester. One, of course, is obvious. You're living in one vis-a-vis medieval Europe, the discovery of new continents and peoples. That map I showed you earlier, of course, map of the world, all of a sudden broken by the discovery of the Americas. All the ancient texts, and people in the Middle Ages and the early modern Europe, they loved ancient texts. They trusted ancient texts. Ancient texts were authorities. They took, deadly seriously. All of a sudden you discover, something completely new. That begins to change people's perspectives on the world, obviously, in many ways. Secondly, new philosophies challenge ideas of nature and authority. We'll talk about some of these. When I talk about the Galileo, the whole lecture on the whole Galileo affair, I'll talk about the background to what's sometimes called the scientific revolution. How you have different ideas of nature, which, as you'll see, are based on ancient ideas, but they begin to challenge the regnant ideas of nature that reigned during the Middle Ages. Not just the natural world, physical world, but human nature, different notions of knowledge and how you know things, and what human nature is like. All those other things get challenged. And of course, this is one of the reasons why people look to this era, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th century, as being early modern, because as anticipations of a later period. The origins of modern political philosophies, John Locke, later on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I'll have a whole lecture on social contract theory, so I'm going to get into that sort of thing, where you begin to have ideas that government is not a natural thing. That idea, ancient idea, goes back to Aristotle, that communities are natural. You have natural leaders. You got to obey them because that's human nature. Going against nature is bad. Well, now you begin to have this idea of contract. No, we're all individuals by nature, and we construct government, construct society. These things are beginning to sound modern, even in the 1600s. So we still look back to John Locke, usually to deride him, but also Thomas Hobbes and people like that. But he's one of the first people to write something like a contract theory, where you have this notion of authority being altered out of all proportions. Really hard to overstate. It's really a significant development. And then finally, one of the bigger things that happens, and we'll spend the next few weeks talking about this, next few lectures, I should say. I don't know how when you're listening to these necessarily, but I think in terms of weekly, assignments, Western Christianity becomes permanently divided, and this will have political consequences. The permanent division between Protestant and Catholic in Western Europe will shape, politics and international diplomacy for a long, long time. Although as we're going to see, maybe we shouldn't overdo it too much. There's already plenty of conflict in the Middle Ages. And even after the Western divide, as you'll see, because I'll do a whole lecture on this, on the religious wars, sometimes you're going to have co-religionists fighting each other anyway. So that'll be an interesting question, is how religious are the religious wars? And so those things will massively alter the situation. Not quite to, I guess, by 1800, what we'd think of as modern, just right on the cusp of it. And again, this depends on one of the things you're going to see here is this depends how you want to define things. What's modern? It's not just the most recent thing. What makes for modernity? I took a class when I was an undergraduate with a very prominent medieval historian, guy who did Eastern medieval history, Bulgarian history. One of these guys, he was very, very prominent in his, I know you have no idea what this is, but in the academic world, he was very prominent. I could speak 10 languages. He was an amazing guy, good teacher. He told me with a straight face one time, he thought the modern world began no later than 1350. And he had good reasons for it too. So again, it depends on what you see as being modern. It depends on those definitions. And no, you can't just say whatever you want. Like, it doesn't mean there are a range of things. It's not necessarily set in stone. So that's one of the things I want you to think about in here. What does it mean to be modern? How different are we from these people? Because then again, in a way, what I want you to get here is it's hard to get at what people were like in the past. And the world is so different from us. You're not living the life of a medieval peasant or a modern, farmer or something. And yet there's still enough continuity we can recognize certain things, and maybe even there's still a legacy that they left us. The initial challenges that they face still have some connection to the challenges we face, even in the 21st century, where we've got, all sorts of things, AI, deep fakes, COVID diseases. Of course, they had diseases. They had the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. So we are dealing with some of the same stuff. So it's very interesting as a comparison. A world that's very unlike yours, but just similar enough where you can get a comparison with your own time. This is one of the reasons why I've always been drawn to this era of history. Now, just to set the stage, just broadly speaking, in the political and social realm of Europe in 1500 or so, and your textbook mentions this in the prologue, but do a great job of it. But Europe as a geographic entity in 1500 is, culturally speaking, a mix of Roman, Germanic, and Christian inheritances from the Roman Empire, ideas of authority. Roman law is very important. Roman law is the basis of basically every modern legal system in Europe. Even the system of law in the Catholic Church, its system of canon law is based on this. It gets revived in the Middle Ages, so it's predominant just there. But then the ideal of empire never goes away. The idea of political unity of Rome it's everywhere. People, of course, look at this in a moment. They speak and write in Latin, so they have that connection, living connection with the Roman world. Germanic inheritance, by that I just mean all the peoples that sort of migrated into, I mean, as a catch-all, not all of them were Germanic, but peoples who came into Western Europe following the fall of the Roman Empire. Germanic peoples, Angles and Saxons, you get into West, that formed the basis, yeah, ethnically speaking to a degree, but also culturally, the laws of France and things of that nature, Anglo-Saxon laws, that's one of the basis of things, of society in medieval and England and France, those sorts of things. Then, of course, the Christian inheritance. The church is the one, it's also a Roman inheritance, but it's also the religious inheritance, which, of course, it goes back to the Middle East in its origins, not even a Western religion. But that's what forms the basis for most people's worldviews. One thing to note about Europe, collectively and individually as states in the late Middle Ages, early modern period beginning, it really is on the periphery of the world civilization in terms of if you were to put a power scale on it, it would not be at the top. It would not be totally at the bottom, but you can make a good argument that, first of all, it's definitely not the top. Like the most powerful, wealthy, sophisticated societies are in Ming Dynasty China, in Asia, and then the Ottoman Empire. Those are the big going empires. There's also an Islamic empire that will emerge in the 16th century in Iran. You can make a case they're all more sophisticated, more wealthy, more powerful. You can make a case that the empires of the Americas, the Aztecs, are maybe more sophisticated, more wealthy. However, this doesn't mean that Western Europe is not, at this point, a culturally and intellectually sophisticated civilization. It is. Things that sort of regressed a little bit during, sometimes called the Dark Ages, but the early Middle Ages, when learning gets basically collapses among lay people and shrinks to just lay learning in monasteries, basically. But by the High Middle Ages, with the reestablishment of universities, they have developed a very sophisticated system of learning, education. Most people can't read or write, but the ones who are learned, it's fairly sophisticated and very culturally sophisticated as well. A highly developed theology, system of theology, philosophy. They have those things, which is interesting. What they don't have, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, is a lot of political or military or economic power. Again, they're inferior to most of these great empires. This, of course, will change. That's the other thing that changes. I didn't mention earlier, by the end of this period, is that's going to flip. But it's not quite there totally, because actually by 1800, still, China is wealthier than any country in the world by far. But with industrialization, this is going to flip overnight. But there's going to be reversals already, because you're even in the 16th century, you're going to have empires being formed, European colonization. You're going to have that shift begin to take place. Again, it's weird how it goes from almost not overnight, it's a couple hundred years, but within a fairly relatively short period of time, in geologic terms, becoming the center of gravity in the world, the way it had not been since the days of Rome. Other aspects of this change. And then another, again, people talk about their world. I mentioned that earlier, that stuff. Talk about Western Christendom. That's the other thing. There's a dual set of identities, which is going to break apart and be replaced by, pretty clearly, by nation states, or at least almost there. Not quite, maybe, by 1800. Western Christendom as the boundary of the Christian world, Christian nations. Which, by the way, if you don't know, I think your textbook mentions this in the prologue, the boundaries of the empire of Charlemagne, when he died in the 9th century, have effectively been the boundaries of Europe, more or less, Western Europe anyway, ever since. In fact, if you go look at a map of the original nations included within the original member states of the European Union in 1992, it's almost identical to Charlemagne's empire. It formed a natural basis. It changes, but still, when we talk about Western Europe, it has these historic, this is in Europe, just a geographic designation. Even Christendom's kind of a malleable thing, but it had actual boundaries as a sense of unity. The other thing that's a sense of unity, of course, is the language of liturgy and learning, which is Latin, which is, again, it comes from the ancient world, but it's not like ancient Latin. We'll get to this when we talk about the Renaissance next time. We'll talk about Erasmus. Latin is the language of the church as it's developed from late antiquity. It has its own language that has been developing and growing, and it's also a language of learning in the Middle Ages in the universities. As you're going to see, the Renaissance is a challenge to this because they're going to revive ancient classical Latin, which is very different. And in some ways, it's going to be a weird regression in a way, because you're reviving this dead language. It was not a dead language in the Middle Ages, the Latin tongue. And then finally, the other thing that gives Europe unity is the jurisdictional authority of the church, although this will be destroyed pretty quickly. The church is a legal body in the Middle Ages. It has church courts. It deals with things like marriages and births and stuff like this, not the state in the Middle Ages. This will be a change in even in Catholic states by the end of this period. We'll have that change because the Reformation will change that, obviously, in Protestant countries. But it has jurisdictional authority. It is very much a legal institution, in addition to being a spiritual religious one. All these things give form and shape at the beginning of the period, and it'll be reshaped at the end of it. Again, depending on your perspective, maybe already radically by 1800, maybe not so much by 1800, depending on how you look at these things. And so just a few of the major players of the European scene circa 1500. First, you have France, I should say, not France, France, it's France. France is one of the two biggest countries in Europe by 1500. It has only recently taken on more or less its modern dimensions as in terms of territory. I have a map I'll show you in a second. You saw the early map I showed you. It's basically a collection of dynastic principalities that have been united under one dynasty, the House of Valois, by 1500. And it's one of the biggest. It's one of the two superpowers, basically, in early modern Europe. We'll get to in a moment. Excuse me. Centered on Paris, but its capital. And then, of course, you have the Crown of Spain. And Spain is also sort of recently united into the single country that we know of Spain. In 1492, the two kingdoms of Castile and Aragon come together, form the Crown of Spain. They will have the other major army in Europe. Much of the 16th century, especially the first part of it, is a clash between these two powers. So that's something to keep in mind. The other three players are well, the third one's still important, the Holy Roman Empire. And this takes some explaining because it's kind of hard to explain what the empire is. They just call it the empire. Nobody says Holy Roman Empire in the Middle Ages or the early modern period. They just call it the empire. This is the empire created by Charlemagne, his descendants. It's no longer really an empire. It's basically an elective German monarchy, which even within this empire, this German monarchy, there are kings. There's the King of Bohemia. There's all the other states who elect a leader. It's hard to explain the governmental system of the Holy Roman Empire because it's not. Whereas France, Spain, England will become models and for the modern nation state because they have consolidated governments. Where, for example, we're going to get to absolute monarchy in this course. The ideal of a nation state, right, where there's a sovereign. The sovereign imposes his will on his territory and stuff like this. Never characterizes the Holy Roman Empire. The emperors are not sovereigns in that sense. They are kind of like, I don't know how to put this exactly. Oh boy, they're not figureheads at all. They have real power, but they can't just impose things. A lot of these princes have rights they can't necessarily trample on. And in fact, the Holy Roman emperors are kind of like presiders who preside over. Think of like a president of a confederation, maybe a better way to put it, except it has this divine sanction because it was created by Charlemagne with the Pope in the 9th century. And so personal loyalty to that divine idea is part of what keeps this empire together, even though it has serious weaknesses. This is the usual narrative, is that the empire is this weak form of government that can't compete with these modern nation states, right? They have a powerful centralized government. And of course, it lasts until 1806, when the last emperor decides to dissolve it so that Napoleon can't get his hands on it and make himself Holy Roman Emperor. But it's very long lived, it lasts for 1,000 years, because it has this adaptability, because the emperors are seen as the ultimate arbiters by these princes. There's a lot of negotiation. Again, unlike France, where Louis XIV would try to impose his will on things, there's a lot more of this going on. That's in the long run. But in the short run, the empire is still very important in the 16th century, partly because one of these Holy Roman emperors is also the King of Spain. And so all that territory that he has, which will become Austria, by the way, later on, become a powerful state in its own right, with its own more modern style of government, is still very important, because you'll have it in the same persons. And if you don't know, I think I mentioned this already, the Holy Roman Empire is an elected monarchy. The princes elect these people. So it's very strange in a way, is the empire and sometimes compared to the modern European Union as being an alternative to modern nation states. I don't know if that comparison works at all, but it's very different and it's hard to put into words how different it is. Then you have a couple of different states. England, which had been a power in the Middle Ages, but in the 15th century, after it will decline for reasons I'll get to in a second. And for the first couple of centuries of this period, no longer a great power. It's really on the periphery in a lot of ways. This will change with the turn of the 18th century. It'll become the great powers in Europe again after 1700. But it too has a consolidated government from the Middle Ages. Consolidated, I mean, basically you have a single system of law. King's writ runs everywhere in England. It's very consolidated. It's not nearly as patchwork and piecemeal as you have these other states, like France has to be put together. Although by the time it gets put together, it becomes a very powerful state, much bigger, has more wealth. But England has that government, even if it doesn't have quite the power as other states do for a while. And then finally, the papal states. And I mentioned the papacy. It, of course, is a spiritual entity, but it also has its own secular territory to raise money and revenue to defend itself against opponents in Italy. This gets it involved in secular politics, well beyond the period of this course. And it is also kind of a unique body. It doesn't have, it's already on the decline by 1500, the influence of the papal states, papacy in political terms. Still be a factor, but definitely on the decline after 1650 or so, to end the 30 Years' War. It's also, but it definitely has an impact going forward, but it's not what it once was. And really neither is the empire. This is usually the narrative, but those are more declining entities. I'm not going to talk too much about this. You'll get some of this in your textbook, but of course, the history of Europe is not just the Western kingdoms. You have the borders in the north, east, and south. In the north, you have Scandinavia, the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, Sweden are the major ones. They don't play a huge role in the history of modern Europe. In terms of ideas, they do actually to a certain degree. The one who actually does in Scandinavia, they'll play a role in the Reformation, that part of it, because they'll all become Protestant, as you'll see, not to spoil it for you. But one of these kingdoms will actually have a brief period as a major military power, and that's Sweden. If you can imagine, Sweden, yes, as a major military power under its king, Gustavus Adolphus, during the 30 Years' War. It's on the periphery. It'll be involved, especially in the late 17th or 18th century, with another power. It's not even a real, it's on the periphery, and definitely in the 16th century, which is Russia. Russia, of course, the Duchy of Moscow proclaims itself as, czars in the course of the 16th century. You do have, peripheral contacts in the 16th century between, say, England. They actually create, in the reign of Elizabeth, a Muscovy company to try to trade with them. But it's in the reign of Peter the Great, of course, that in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, it comes into contact with the West because Peter the Great wants to become a great power, but it'll play a part in all this. You also have Poland closer to the border, Central Europe, which in the Middle Ages had been a big power. You can see from the map, I'll show you one more time before I end this lecture, it was a big kingdom, but it will deteriorate as the early modern period goes along. In fact, it will be annexed by two different countries, one of them Russia, by the end of the 18th century, and disappear. So change there. Then you have to the east as well, Bohemia and Hungary. Bohemia's kingdom in the eastern part of the empire. It's remained part of that for a long time. Then Hungary. I mentioned Hungary partly because it'll be on that eastern border. It will also disappear for a long period in the course of the early modern era. And then the Kingdom of Naples is in the south. It's on the southern half, basically, the boot of Italy, in the peninsula. And it's ruled, I believe, beginning by the Kingdom of Aragon. I'm not mistaken, it's the Castile area. I can't remember. Later on, be ruled by the Bourbon dynasty of France, or relatives of the Bourbon dynasty of France. But it remains an independent kingdom up till up beyond the bounds of this course, actually, but it's the other major power in the Italian peninsula. And then finally, in the southeast, you have the Ottoman Empire. And I have to mention them because they are definitely, well, they're definitely a political threat from the southeast. And it's something people are thinking about to move us into the Reformation era in that period. On the other hand, you also have cities. Civic life picks up in the High Middle Ages, and so you're going to have civic life, a connection of long-term trading routes and stuff like that, connecting places in the early modern period. Italy, of course, places like Genoa, which is, this is where Christopher Columbus is from, maritime cities like this. The one real city-state that'll be alive by most of this period is Venice, and it's kind of on a declining power already, but it's big enough and powerful enough to defend itself. The rest of them get swallowed up in the course of the 16th century by other powers, but the cities of Italy remain important for that reason, Florence, places like that. You also have cities in the Low Countries. In the beginning here, places that we associated with the modern state of Belgium, Antwerp, Bruges are probably more important. As the 16th century progresses, however, power shifts north in the Low Countries. The Low Countries means the Netherlands. I'll show you the map in a second. To what will become the Dutch Republic, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, those places, the Protestant Reformation. And so that'll become, those great trading ports. Dutch will be a great trading power in this period. I forgot to mention them in the early modern period. At the beginning of this period, you have also a series of cities called the Hanseatic League. They're already on the decline, again, by the beginning of this period, but they're it's a league of trading cities up and down the Holy Roman Empire, going up to the Baltic Sea, up into Sweden and Denmark and places like that. So there's civic life. Again, they're not huge cities. The only big ones, anything like big ones, are the two ones that will come to dominate European life by the end of this course, London and Paris. I want to say London has 75,000 people by the end of the Middle Ages. I don't know about Paris, but they'll be the two, prototypical modern capitals moving forward. Culturally, politically, they'll have outsized influence within both of those kingdoms. Rome, of course, is the spiritual center of Western Europe in the beginning of this course. It's in a bad way by the end of the Middle Ages. It's kind of a nasty, dirty place. And of course, we're going to get to Rome's really corrupt the church and the city by the end of the Middle Ages. It's never been a nice place, actually. In the Middle Ages, it's mostly kind of a mud hole. That's why the papacy actually leaves for the better part of a century, because they want to get away. Well, they want to get away from the city itself, but also because of aristocratic families fighting over the papacy. They leave in the 14th century and come back. They go to Avignon, France. However, by the end of this course, by the end of the 16th century, the popes of the Renaissance and the later Counter-Reformation will turn Rome into maybe the great cultural center of Europe for the better part of a century. This will be this is the Rome of Michelangelo and Bernini and Caravaggio. You live in the area, the great Caravaggio you have, and the Nelson Atkins Museum. So you have that as a transformation. Then finally, toward the end of the period, you had the founding of St. Petersburg, another great city on the Baltic Sea by Peter the Great, to sort of establish links with the West. So there's some of the major, just to get the major lay of the land here we're talking about. And then finally, to set the stage for the Reformation era, a few things that have happened. One, I mentioned this before, the fall of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire in 1453 to the Ottoman Empire. And from the 1460 onwards, they make many attempts to make their way into Europe. They invade Italy in the 1470s. They capture Otranto at one point in southern Italy. They will make their way into the Balkans. In 1526, they will defeat a Hungarian army and take over large parts of southern Hungary. In fact, eventually they'll take over the whole kingdom. And in 1529, they almost take Vienna. They'll attack Vienna several times throughout this period. The last time will be 1683. It is a real threat. It's on the minds of the papacy, the empire, many people who are not so much the Western kingdoms. They're not threatened as directly, but those people are really concerned about this in the 16th century. And rightly so, because Ottomans are the going power. They're the biggest, baddest power really in Europe at that point. Now, what happens is, I mentioned before, the two biggest, baddest powers that are going to emerge from Western Europe are France and Spain. And France emerges from this because they win, partly because they win the 100 Years' War with England. Remember, this is a dynastic war starting in the 1330s, in which English king tries to make a claim to the throne of France. They invade, they actually take over half the country, they occupy the kingdom, they get Henry V gets his heir recognized. It looks like it's going to be an English-speaking kingdom or something before Joan of Arc rescues the French. But with the I think it's the Duchy, I can't remember which one actually, in the 1490s, with the last coming together of the last pieces, dynastic pieces of the French crown, it becomes one of the big unified states in Europe. It's actually, by the way, one of the things that makes France unique is that because of the 100 Years' War, it develops the first standing army in Europe since the days of Charlemagne. You didn't have standing armies like in the Middle Ages. You just, if you're a king, you'd send your troops home to their fields so they could, plow and all that stuff. And in fighting season, you'd call them back and have your retainers, recruit for you. But they're the ones, again, because of that, they developed, again, early systems of taxation to pay for that. So they're kind of in the vanguard of this. The other thing, of course, I've already mentioned before, is the Union of Castile and Aragon, which is consequent upon their victory. To mention this, the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Spanish Peninsula, of Iberian Peninsula, from the Kingdom of Granada, from the Muslim kingdoms that have been there since the early Middle Ages, which leads to the formation of a massive kingdom in 1492. And what's going to happen is in 1494, the French are going to invade. Charles VIII invades Italy. Italy has a lot of wealth. It has all this wonderful stuff from the Renaissance at that point, Italian Renaissance. And for the next 50 to 60 years, you're going to have warfare between French and their allies in Italy and the Spanish and their allies in Italy for control of that region. And it's going to take up a lot of their time and energy. We'll get to this a little bit more next time. It's in the background of a lot of the stuff that's going on in the Reformation. And so that's the diplomatic situation in general terms in the beginnings of the early modern era. Just to bring this to a conclusion and just show you one last time the map to give you a sense of this. France here, Spain here, all this stuff in the middle is the empire, various states, northern Italy, the Papal States, Naples, then England up here with Scotland. I forgot to mention Scotland. And then this is Ireland with all their different tribes that don't have a unity. Like they're already have an English colony there in the Middle Ages, but that's the basic breakdown. And so next time you read the chapters, the second chapter deals with, first chapter deals with your book with social life. Second chapter will deal with Renaissance and Reformation. So the next couple of lectures will be on the Renaissance and the Reformation. I'll talk about Desiderius Erasmus and as a figure sort of representing the Renaissance. And then Martin Luther, of course, the great Protestant reformer, how those things come together in that whole first part of the 16th century. So, end of that lecture. I hope you guys get out of this. If you haven't started reading, get started, and hopefully I'll hear from you soon.